The Calamity Mod for Terraria adds a total of 26 new bosses to the game. Of course, some are better than others. After having played through the mod 6 or 7 different times, I thought it was time I sat down and ranked all of them from worst to best. Criteria I will be taking into account include sprites, theming, design, and overall how much fun the boss is to fight. Keep in mind, this is solely based on my opinion and my individual experiences with these bosses. This is not the objective list by any means. And while I may slander some of them, the Calamity devs do have my utmost respect and support. With that in mind, let's get started. Now, as you may know, Calamity adds a lot of worm bosses, around like 8 or so I think. Without the unique and fun gimmicks that many of the other worm bosses have to set them apart from the rest, Stormweaver completely falls flat as a boss. It isn't thematically interesting, it doesn't have much of a loot table, and its attacks are repetitive and annoying, so if one boss was going to be last, it was this one. Ravager is well sprited and is pretty cool thematically. What it suffers from is generally being extremely unfun to fight. The boss uses all sorts of ways to restrict your movement, essentially making you walk around for the whole fight with an occasional dash. The attacks and AI also feel very jank to me, almost like they're unfinished. Because of the cool theming, I hope to see some future updates give this boss some much needed love. This is a boss that has always been unremarkable and forgettable. Almost by design, it serves as a stepping stone for another fight. With that, it was also relatively inoffensive, a quick and easy skirmish before Providence. Recently, however, they've updated this boss, and it's stupid how difficult it is. The boss now floods your screen with an offensive amount of projectiles and moves way faster. It's so bad that I'd say Providence's Guardians are now a harder fight than Providence herself. That's just ridiculous. This boss takes a bad concept, which is Duke Fishron, but well, old, and executes it even worse. Everything that made the original fight fun is gone. The original Duke Fishron was a fast-paced, intense fight that was brief but memorable. Despite hitting very hard, he didn't have much health, so you could take Duke down at any point of hard mode if you tried hard enough. This made for a difficult challenge that was optional but had great rewards. Old Duke is the opposite of that. It is an incredibly slow and boring fight, primarily because Old Duke has entirely too much health. Even with a damaged loadout and on-tier weapons, this fight can easily take over 20 minutes. Not only that, but there's practically no incentive to fight this boss either. It isn't particularly fun, and the loot is next to useless for most. At least the sprite and summoning method are genuinely great, and that's what puts it above the bosses below it on this list. Astrum Aureus is a boss with many major flaws. For one, there is very little incentive to fight him at the intended point on progression. The loot isn't needed to take down Moonlord at all. Also, the fighting experience itself is somewhat unpleasant with uninteresting and overtuned attacks. And to top it all off, it's a timed fight, which just makes it a stressful race to kill it in time. What puts it above the bosses below it is that the summoning method, the loot table, and theming are legitimately very cool. I also like the concept of a post-Pillars pre-Moonlord boss, just not the execution. As the first boss of the game, Desert Scourge, though iconic, doesn't have much going for it. Aside from the minions, it only has, say, 2 or 3 attacks. It also doesn't entirely succeed as an early game boss because your success is almost entirely dependent on how big your arena is and how many movement accessories you have. It's also over way too quickly, regardless of if you win or lose. I do really like the drops and the way it unlocks the Sunken Sea. That's always been one of my favorite parts of Calamity progression. Cryogen is a fairly inoffensive boss, but it's also pretty bland. As an early hard mode boss, it was bound to be this way as it's around this point. The main progression is also pretty boring, but I really wish it wasn't. The fight can take a very long time with early hard mode gear, and despite having many different phases, they all feel pretty much the same, the exception being the last one. So, not great, but not the worst either. Like the Profane Guardians, the entire point of Calamitous is to be a stepping stone to another boss. It's literally a watered down version of a much better fight, but that's the intention. It does come across as somewhat forgettable, especially with the similarity to the twins, but I do like the brothers and some of the new attacks. Speaking of forgettable, Astrum Aureus is possibly one of the least memorable bosses on this list. It isn't bad by any means though. The sprite is gorgeous and so is the music. The attacks present a fairly fun challenge that takes some getting used to as well. As someone who greatly prefers Crimson Worlds, I don't fight the Hive Mind all that often, but when I do, it doesn't leave too much of an impression on me. I like the idea that it swarms you with members of the Hive Mind throughout, so I wish they would expand on that concept a little more to make it a bit more exciting. Poltergeist is very visibly a clone of Plantera, which brings it down a little bit. However, the lore behind the boss's existence is enough to win me over. As for the boss itself, it's pretty tricky, and I don't particularly enjoy digging out a dungeon arena for it. It cloning itself in the third phase is a great idea that really makes you think about your movement, and I actually think making that clone killable in recent updates has made this boss less interesting. It definitely isn't as much of a threat as it used to be, but I still like it. What a well-designed boss this is. It's well-sprited, intimidating, fast-paced, and chaotic. Each attack is uniquely terrifying in its own way. This boss would be so much higher on the list if it was just balanced properly. For attacks that are so hard to dodge, they do entirely too much damage. It only takes 3 or 4 hits to go down in most scenarios. You're supposed to fight Plaguebringer Goliath before Ravager, but I've struggled against it with post-Moonlord gear. Just nerf it a little bit and the devs will have a legendary boss on their hands. Before 1.4T mod loader, Crabulon would have been placed way lower, and that's because you always had to dig out a huge space to have any chance. Now that 1.4 mushroom biomes are here, that problem is gone and you can focus on the great things here, like the music, killer scheme, and the shroom attacks. Brimstone Elemental is a good boss in my book. Her attacks are interesting and fun to dodge, and the vibe of the fight and the surrounding environment is really nice. Though I do wish the Brimstone Crag was a little bit more developed. Like Brimstone Elemental, Cygnus has a great vibe with the music and colors. He's also a great concept. Though if you utilize certain movement techniques, he fails to be much of a threat. I overall just really like Cygnus, despite the fact there really isn't the most there. Now I know that many of you are going to hate me for putting the dog this low. And trust me, I hate to put him all the way down here too. But in its current state, I just can't justify putting him any higher. I feel like the boss suffers from being changed too often. The devs can't decide on what they want to do with him, and it feels like he gets a rework literally every update. The fight in its current state also feels extremely clunky and confusing, and quite frankly like not much of a threat. I just really hope the devs can figure out something that works and settle on it. But of course, the masterful spriting and music can't be ignored, and this is possibly the most iconic boss of the mod, so he does come in ahead of a lot of other bosses. You're probably yelling at the screen right now for Aquatic Scourge being above the Devourer, but I can safely say this is one of the mod's best worm bosses currently. Having it spawn pre-hard mode and tying it to the Acid Rain event makes the boss feel very connected to the biome and the world it exists in, which I appreciate a great deal. The music is pleasant but still fast-paced enough to suit the fight. And as for the battle itself, it's a delight to weave between the swarms of little sand blasts. Maybe I'm just a sucker for short, well-designed bullet hells like this one. The Perforators are easily one of my favorite pre-hard mode bosses, vanilla or otherwise. Because of the intensity of the music and gameplay, it's a whole lot of fun overall. I really dig the theming in Worms as well, just a solid fight all together. This is another one like Devourer of Gods that, though iconic, has probably received too many changes for its own good. The most baffling one would be removing one of the most unique and interesting aspects of it, that being the fight being split into 2 parts. That being said, the changes haven't been to as bad of a degree. The new AI and portal sprites are genuinely amazing and really improve the fight. As a whole, it feels like a very epic and grand experience, which is really something special. Roar the Jungle Dragon is one of DM Dokuro's best works, with some genuinely moving lyrics too. Oh, and if they implemented his new sprite, he would bump up several spots. The Ceaseless Void is an incredible concept. Basically, it's a hole in space-time that's out to kill you. The music of the battle is intense and fitting, and defeating the dark energies is incredibly satisfying. The new black hole attack added recently is just top-notch. Overall, a superb and creative encounter. Unlike the other bosses on this list, I don't have much experience with the Exo mechs. I've only fought them once, and that was in multiplayer, so take this placement with a grain of salt. I did like what I did see, which was full framing, justice done to the figure of Drayden, gorgeous sprites and attacks. Some of you may be absolutely dumbfounded about the Dragonfolly being this high, but hear me out. I just love the casual energy of this fight. It's just so much fun at every step. The Dragonfolly's weird AI presents an entertaining challenge to overcome, and I adore the loot table here, with him dropping my favorite mount in the entire game, vanilla or otherwise. I know that many people are sad that this boss isn't Bumbleburb anymore, but if you give it a fair chance, it's great in its own right. I know this boss has a hate club, and I totally get why. It's not for everyone, but just watch. I absolutely love the grand scale and scope of this fight. It truly is a step up from everything that comes before it in progression, making it a sort of gauntlet to post-Moonlord. The attacks, while harsh and unforgiving, still feel fair, which makes them incredibly fun to dodge time and time again, not to mention the incredible color scheme and theming present. What is there to even say about Slime God? Out of all the bosses in the mod, this is probably one of the ones I look forward to the most. Despite being in pre-hard mode, it still carries a certain gravitas and importance while also being incredibly iconic. I also just love late pre-hard mode mobility, that feeling of dashing around with horseshoe, balloons, and the like. With top tier music, fast pacing, and interesting mechanics, this boss is simply amazing. Leviathan and Anahita is genuinely one of the most innovative boss fights there is. An amazing concept, two opposites forming an unbreakable bond, executed to perfection. The music at every stage is beautiful and the design is spectacular. There are so many ways to approach the fight and so much to contend with, all the while carrying incredible theming and a sense of grandeur. But coming in at number 1 is Supreme Calamitus. Recently, this fight received a much needed visual overhaul, giving the Brimstone Witch and her brother's human sprites. This was a huge improvement, but even before this, Scal would have still been first. Why, you may ask? Because of the design of her attacks. It's so intricate and multi-layered, and despite the crushing difficulty, it never feels like the game's fault when I die. This is why after sinking in hundreds of attempts across many playthroughs, it never got boring or frustrating for me. And finally, I cannot believe the musical prowess of DM Dokuro. He composed an incomparable piece, a 12-minute opera with 4 movements, a full choir, and thematically appropriate lyrics. I don't know why he would choose to do that for a boss in a Terraria mod, but I'm so glad he did. It's for all these reasons and more that Supreme Calamitus will forever be the best boss in the Calamity mod. Well, that's it. That's my ranking of all 26 bosses in the Calamity mod. If you have your own ranking, feel free to drop it down in the comments below. And stay tuned for the next few episodes of Calamity multiplayer series.